And now the open interest is 100,000 contracts higher, and we're at this pitiful price. Something is very wrong in the silver market. Yes, I think the move is going to be historic.
Hello there, my friends. Chris Marcus here with you on the Miles Franklin channel on Tuesday, August 7th, 2018. And today I'm excited to have a very special guest, Bill Murphy of Gata, who I've been learning from and following his research for about a decade now. If you don't know about Bill, he's really done in my opinion, heroic effort standing up to a lot of the forces that are not necessarily doing such great things in our economy and digging into the gold and silver manipulation. So it's a real pleasure to have you here today, Bill. Thanks for coming on, and how are you, my friend? Good
to be here and give my best to Dave and Andy. Well, they've given us great support over the years, and I wanted to know how much Chris and I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, that's Dave Kramsler and Andy Scheckman, two other figures in this movement trying to get some good market pricing. And with that said, Bill, now that we're reaching August of 2018, I think this has gone on longer, the suppression of the metals than most might have guessed. What are you seeing these days? Any signs for optimism? And what are you looking at that people should be aware of?
Well, the time it's taken for this to end is way longer than expected, as you just said. And, you know, I know what's coming, but when has been impossible to predict, and anybody that's done so keeps getting egg on their face.
Yeah, it's certainly, I think a lot of people have struggled with the when, because we really can't know that part. Although one of the things you've mentioned in several interviews over the past couple of years is that you've been looking for silver to cross the $21–$21.50 range, and that could be perhaps a turning point. And I've been curious, I've heard you mention that several times, if you could explain a little more why that particular level and what might happen should we reach that.
Well, silver is beyond a nightmare. I've used to trade a lot of commodities, and I think I know something about it, but it is bizarre beyond comprehension. The open interest right now is up to 232,000, the number of longs and shorts in the COMEX, at a price which is just about the cost of production for many. And it's normally a normal market, the open interest would be disappearing. Hedgers would leave, speculators would leave. But silver is, 10,000 contracts from its all-time high, while gold is like 210,000 contracts from its all-time high. But getting back to try to answer this question, J.P. Morgan and gang have been suppressing this market for over 7 years now. They just destroyed the sentiment in the sector. They're driving out all the interest in the West. And they keep pressing and pressing and pressing. It's just my opinion that when we get going, it's going to explode this time. We're going to have the fastest move in the history of markets. It'll be a little bit like the cryptos did of late. And what's going to kick that off, in my opinion, is $21 plus silver. That's about where it went to after Brexit. It's been under pressure ever since, and it's the heaviest, worst acting market I've ever seen in 40 years. But I'm a firm believer in Newton's law. As bad as things are, as disgusted as everybody is, it's going to be one of the biggest moves in history. When that's going to start to kick in, I don't know, because many of us thought it would start by now, and there's no sign of it yet.
Right. Yeah, and that it makes a lot of sense to me because, again, having a background trading equity options and working in the markets, it's almost as if everything possible to guarantee that you would have, almost as Peter Schiff used to say, if you stuff the beach ball underwater, the farther you push it, the higher it has to explode. You touched on J.P. Morgan, and I know you're familiar with Ted Butler, who I read regularly and think does a great job of researching. Curious if you have any opinion. I know Ted feels pretty confident that J.P. Morgan has somewhere in the 700 to 800 million ounces of silver that he feels they've acquired. I know you dig into that closely as well. Any thoughts, and do you think that that number is about accurate, that they've wired, which would be essentially about half of the above ground supply of silver in the world, which is stunning. What's your take on that story?
Well, Ted's a very smart guy, and God bless him, but he's been telling us about J.P. Morgan and their visible supply, which should be bullish, and he's correct. For me, it's the most bearish thing I've ever seen because that's what we hear about.
Mm-hmm.
We know that J.P. Morgan, the Fed's bank, has been the big short in the silver market and the paper market, and it just goes on and on and on. Theoretically, Ted should be right on the money here, but it never seems to change. And it's the one thing outside of the high open interest that's visible that we can see is the talk about J.P. Morgan's physical position.
Right.
And it's very strange because when silver made its move to $50 in 2011, the open interest was 133,000 contracts back then. J.P. Morgan was fully involved, having supposedly taken over Bear Stearns' position.
Right.
Why did they let silver go up to 50 in 2011? And now the open interest is 100,000 contracts higher, and we're at this pitiful price. Something is very wrong in the silver market. Yes, I think the move is going to be historic. I don't know when it's going to kick in, and all I can say is, for my people, we keep looking for something to change, and so far it hasn't.
Right. So do you feel that, as I've thought about how this could unfold, there could be, as David Morgan's talked about, a force majeure on the COMEX, where essentially my understanding is the contracts are worded that they can say, all right, here's your $15, and then silver opens up in trades. I've seen that as one possibility, although what I've been primarily always looking for is that if we have all this paper, silver, and gold out there, which you hear estimates as high as, I know Bill Holter says 500 to 1 for every piece of metal. Do you see it heading to some point? Again, we don't know for sure how it develops, but is at least one of the main possibilities that eventually someone shows up for their metal and the metal just simply isn't there to deliver because there's so much paper written against it. Do you see it possibly unfolding like that and heading towards that point?
Absolutely. 7 weeks ago, the gold cartel, as I call it, raided the market. Gold was 1304, silver 1723. It's been nothing but straight down action ever since. And it's my hope that what I call an endgame is in progress, that this suppression scheme at these pitiful levels is on its way out in a gradual manner. And that is because they're going to run out of physical supply of gold and silver at these lowly price levels. There's so much going on behind the scenes which nobody knows. The only thing we can see is the price action. But I know you've heard about these exchange for physicals where they're disappearing from the COMEX. Hasn't meant a thing, but it is so bizarre. And the commodity CFTC won't explain what's going on. And I think eventually what we're headed for is exactly what you're talking about. The physical supply is going to dry up, and all of a sudden they won't be able to stop the prices from exploding because somebody's going to ask for metal that isn't there.
Right, right. And speaking of the EFPs, which exchange for physical for people who are unaware, do you have any thoughts on that? I think there's been a lot of confusion, even among some of the precious metals analysts, where essentially if we're adding, which I hear has been going somewhat exponential with these EFPs, is it appropriate to think of that as similar to almost an equivalent of more paper contracts? Or, I mean, when we see these growing EFP number, is that just more leverage in the market, or how are you looking at those?
It makes no sense. I've called the CFTC. They won't explain it. I haven't. All the smart guys that I know have asked them, that they please explain it to me what is really going on, and they don't. I mean, our friend Harvey Organ's done a great job in this regard, tabulating everything that's there. But theoretically, this exchange for physicals would mean that the metal isn't here, so they're shifting it to London. It disappears, but it's not disappearing from London. So I'm trying to figure it out, but I can't. And it's a newer phenomenon, but I do believe it's part of the antics of this gold cartel and what they're doing. It's something that they're doing that's related to the paper market and to the precious metals markets, which is deceiving the real story. And because these exchange for physicals that we're talking about is a relatively new phenomenon in recent years.
Yeah, and I've talked with some of my friends who get into the more technical side of some of these contracts and the banking deals, and I get varying answers. So, and I think, like you said, if you call the agency that's supposed to be regulating it and they can't even answer it, it is what it is, which again, I think is challenging for people on one hand because the folks who saw the money printing saw where this was going and bought gold and silver as what I would say a very logical and intelligent response. Then you get this environment where things are so challenging, which again is why I feel what you and Chris Powell over at Gata do is so important in terms of just letting people know what's going on, because I think I often find it similar to the housing bubble, 2007, 2008, when it collapsed. You could have seen that early and you weren't wrong. You just had to wait for it to occur. So again, you've talked about some of the leverage factors. Of course, we have countries repatriating their gold, China making petro yuans. Any thoughts overall, just again, of what you're seeing in the economic environment to help people maybe put their mind at rest if they're wondering whether to buy gold or not? Any comments on any of the other developments that are going on a macro level that would support that?
Well, this is the sad part about all of this. On the macro level, we had zero interest rates, didn't mean a thing.
Right.
We had budget deficits in the trillions of dollars, not only in the United States, but different parts of the world. Hasn't meant a thing. You've had a 7-year bear market, and that's where Gata comes in. That's because it was orchestrated by this gold cartel. Mm-hmm. Right now, for example, even in the last break, the dollar hasn't done anything. Nothing. Right. Gold went down $100. Silver went down $2. The dollar is like a fraction lower than the day when it started, or dollar was a fraction higher, I should say. All I can say is the risk reward for owning gold and silver is getting better and better. Is it frustrating and aggravating because of what other markets are doing, assets that keep rising? And, we're in the weeds here. But when this turns, it's going to be dramatic. And as I mentioned, I don't know when it is. And so far, none of my colleagues or people I respect have any clue either, because of the ones that have thought they did have been wrong. But when it happens, it's going to be dramatic. And a lot of people that get out won't get back in because there won't be the corrections like we used to have or are having.
Right.
So they'll wait for a pullback and they won't get in and they'll miss it. I know that Jim Sinclair has talked about this. This is what happened in the late 70s. A lot of people get tired of being in the golden market, and they got out and they missed the historic move. And that's what's coming again, except much more dramatic, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because, again, from a trading perspective, I get it. It's hard if you have to sit here for a couple of years like many of us have. Yet, if you think of gold and silver as a form of savings where you just leave it there, really gives you an advantage, because let's say silver goes up $2 or $3 and then someone's sitting there. I find a common mindset is, well, should I wait for it to go back lower? And, you really have that chance of missing out with something that has such a huge skew to the upside. So I think that you phrased that well. And is worthwhile for people to think about. One last question I have here. I thought this would be a fun one for you, especially since you have already mentioned the CFTC. Did you happen to ever catch any of those podcasts they've been releasing lately?
I'm sort of prejudiced against it because in 2010, I testified in front of the CFTC on a hearing, which was put all over the internet, and the only interview we all had 5 minutes. The only person to be blocked out was myself, and they said it was due to a technical difficulty.
Right.
I'm not looking at any more of what they're putting out there.
Yeah, and actually one question related to that, which I would love to hear your comment on. Many folks know about Andrew Maguire, who's been a whistleblower in the market, and I remember that interview he did, I believe it was with King World News and Adrian Douglas. And Andrew, who basically contacted them and explained how the manipulation worked, you can Google and find the transcript of him explaining it to someone before it happened in the agency, and then can you confirm that basically he was removed from the witness list? So here's someone talking about how it goes down, explaining it, and basically they said, we're not going to bring you to the meeting.
Well, you nailed it. I mean, he thought he was going to be at the meeting, and the day before the meeting, or a couple of days, they told him he was not going to be on it. He got a hold of Adrian Douglas, and we got the material that he sent before things occurred. And so Bart Chilton, who really was a good guy, gave me some time after my presentation in the question and answer period to read pretty much what Andrew had presented. So we rehearsed that in advance and made that available to all the members of the CFTC. And at least we got something out of it. But Andrew was the one who brought it to our attention.
Right. Which again, for folks, I know it's, especially if you're watching CNBC and some of the mainstream stuff, when you hear about manipulation in the market, on the face of it, there's a tendency to think, all right, this isn't actually happening yet. Again, this is why and I think a lot of the silver and gold community is grateful to you, Bill and Gata, for bringing a lot of this information to light, because it's really almost an investigation more than looking at the financial numbers to figure out what's going on. That was really a big turning point for me, where again, as I was first beginning to research it, seeing, all right, here's a guy who's laying it out pretty clearly and they disinvite him, you know, kind of like the auditing the Fed. If it's there, why wouldn't you want to audit it?
Well, absolutely. And all I can say is, as tough a time as this is, what Gata knows is, for me anyways, the most important thing to understand about the gold and silver markets. They are at artificially low prices that will not stand. And the equal and opposite reaction, that Newton's law thing, it's going to be spectacular. The moves are going to be much faster and greater than we've ever seen before when this thing blows up. And it keeps me in the game, and hopefully what God is doing and shows like yourselves, you know, to get the message out there will keep people in the game.
Yeah, and along those lines, I guess the question where I mentioned the podcast, because James McDonald, one of the new commissioners who's been there, I guess about a year now, has done some podcasts, which they got me riled up, because essentially he was coming on being interviewed and saying, we need people to police the markets. I guess he was calling for a self-policing policy. So if our, again, assumptions on JP Morgan are accurate, maybe they'll call them and turn themselves in one day. But aside from that, it was frustrating, because he's saying we want to have integrity in the markets. We want people to report it. And here, you know, there's folks like Ted, like yourself, like Chris, who are reporting it. And I guess the question here is, he mentioned in his last one that he needs specific evidence. You know, everyone writes in saying it's manipulated. So let's say James McDonald were listening right now and wanted to know what he could do to clearly see where things are getting a little askew. What would you say to James, and if you had the chance to talk with him?
Well, just for starters, to keep it simple, explain the silver open interest and who all these shorts are, have been there all these years suppressing the price. I mean, there's supposed to be certain limits to what institutions can do in terms of affecting the price. And, you know, explain that right away. And then, you know, when talk about JP Morgan, and people talk about conspiracies, and they shake their head, rigging the markets. Well, about 3 or 4 years ago, our time's going by, JP Morgan was fined $34 billion at one time for rigging 3 or 4 different markets. These are facts. These aren't opinion. These are on the record. So the fact is that JP Morgan has been out there rigging markets is known to the world. But you talk about gold and silver because it's related to the U.S. government and what they're doing and what's behind it, the Bank for International Settlements, taking on the rich and powerful. The financial media won't touch it. People just won't go there. And I've been doing this 20 years now. I just can't believe how right we are in the sense what a taboo subject it is. If it weren't that way, people would, you know, it wouldn't be so, you know, kept under the covers.
Yeah, and I believe, wasn't it the dollar? I think they got fined for doing something with the dollar index about a month or two ago. I believe it was a CFTC fine for JP Morgan And of course, I know some people think the banks are big and powerful, so they never lose on these things. Again, if JP Morgan actually has as much silver as I think is likely they do, they would win. Although for people who are wondering if there is any degree to which the markets still work, Bill, I'm sure you remember the big whale for JP Morgan with that credit index back in 2011, where was a reminder that even if you're a big bank, if you pile something on too big, that's the nature of trading. You can always be squeezed out of it. So again, for folks who are wondering, will this ever end? I think it will. Bill, it sounds like from everything you're seeing, still as frustrating as it has been to watch the price sit there despite what's happening in the world, that it's worthwhile for people to hang tight and just hang on to their gold and silver, and patience will be paying off, in your opinion?
I think it's the best risk reward situation anybody will ever see in their lifetime. The downside is minimal, $1-2. Upside, pick a number, 100, 200. It's going to be sensational when it goes, and it's unfortunately it's taking longer, than we thought it would, but it'll pay off in spades.
Beautifully put, my friend. That matches what I've been seeing, again, which is why it's such a pleasure to talk with you today, to have followed your work for the past decade. For people who would like to support Gata, which I know you guys really do a great effort, and it's not always the easiest thing to keep running, how can they find you, and is there anything they can do to help support and help this cause to bring back free market pricing in our markets?
Yeah, well, my colleague Chris Powell does a great job. They can go to www.gata.org and get on his mailing list and see if they care to support us. And then for myself, I'm at lametropolcafe.com, and people can sign up for a 2-week free trial and see if the material presented is of interest.
There you go, folks. I highly recommend both of those. As I mentioned, I'm a big fan of Bill's work, and I think you're doing great stuff over there. Appreciate you coming on and sharing a few minutes, and feel this is great advice for people to be aware of. So keep up the good fight, my friend. Let me know if there's anything else we can do at Miles Franklin to support you. But again, appreciate getting to finally talk to you in person, and thank you so much.
And Chris, thank you for all you do, and hopefully next time we're together like this, it's high-fiving time.
I think it's coming. In fact, I was just up at the Sprott conference, which was incredible. And I was thinking about how you had such a great energy and so many smart folks who see what's going on and are coming up with solutions. And I was thinking, wow, it's going to be exciting to see whenever it happens to get together. It's a great community. And I hear you're going to be at the New Orleans Investment Conference this year. Is that right?
Yeah, Brian London's been a great guy to Gata over a period of time, and we look forward to going to that conference every year.
Well, right on. I'm going to be there. We'll look forward to seeing you in person. Thanks again for being on today, and we'll look forward to talking to you again in the future, Bill.
Thank you, Chris.